Dark and Final Space by Erika Bauer. It was a pleasure to burn. That first sip like coming home, she thought, burning out all the old thoughts, replacing them with that calm emptiness, that final shrug of the shoulders that lays it all down. Again, she said to the bartender, "Please," she added. "Again, please." The bartender poured another bourbon. All the old cliches were in place. A dimly lit bar dotted by wet rings from happier times. A woman staring into a glass, her mascara just beginning to do the nighttime fade into the corners of her eyes. A spattering of men of indeterminate age sunk into bar stools and back corners. It was Hemingway without the clean, well-lightedness. "Let me guess," the bartender said. "A guy, right?" He was older than the woman at the bar by some marginal amount that daylight might reveal. He used the towel in his hands to wipe the wet rings away, his hands moving in a circular hypnotic motion. "You can tell me, attorney-client privilege, am I right?" He smiled at her, but she didn't see it. Her eyes were on the glass. The woman didn't want to answer, but she knew that not answering was also an answer. She could tell him to mind his damn business. She could smile and remain quiet. She could lie and tell him she lost her job. In the end, though, she was tired and she kept it simple. "He's leaving," she said simply. "He's leaving and it's too late." The bartender nodded like he already knew. "Yep," he said, "heard that one before. Except it's never too late, you know. I mean, it can be late, but there's never a too late, not ever." He laid out a row of wet shot glasses and began to dry them. Somewhere in the back of the bar, darts softly sailed through the air, each one hitting the target with a precise exhalation. A man alone at a table began to slump down, allowing the alcohol to take in the rest of the weight of that good night. "It's too late," she said. "He got a new job in a new city. He sold his apartment. And I didn't say a thing, you know, not one goddamn thing. Not one, hey, you know, by the way, I sort of love you. I think I sort of want you to stay. I sort of want." She imagined her hands on the back of his neck. That part of a man's neck where the hair is cut close and feels so pretty if you run your fingers through it, so shallow like waves. Her eyes met the bartender's. "Well, you know what I want," she trailed off. He nodded slowly, more than once, enough to clearly say how much he knew. He set a napkin down on the bar. "Write it down," he said. "Write down what you would have said to him, if you had had the chance, you know." She looked at him, the mascara of her right eye now beyond the point of repair. "It'll help, Scout's honor." It was such a funny thing to say in a place like this, a dark place. A place where people swallowed feelings and forced their hands to steady and pretended that the laughter coming from their mouths also didn't sound a bit like screams, a bit like tears. She almost waited for him to raise his right hand, Scout's honor and all. Instead, he pushed the napkin closer. "Go on," he said. "Another bourbon," she said. He nodded his head, poured the bourbon, and set a pen down next to the napkin. "Real fucking funny," she said. She wanted it to sound forceful, but it didn't. It came out too rehearsed, too detached. She was already beginning to think about the pen and the napkin and the note. She was already imagining herself mailing it later that night, just walking up to the blue box at 2:30 a.m. and stuffing it in an envelope and grabbing a stamp and dropping it into the box before she had time to think. The bartender picked up the dried shot glasses and walked to the other side of the counter. The pen sat there waiting. The man at the table behind her continued his alcoholic slumber, alone in his booth. The dart players finished their game and asked for another round of beers. She picked up the pen. She stretched out the napkin. For an entire year, she had watched him arrive in the morning to work, a 5-minute window of his arrival, a kind of religion. It was something she'd never admit, how she wouldn't leave his desk during those 5 minutes, or she might miss the first glimpse of him walking down the hall. Sometimes she would try to arrange a pretense for passing him in the hallway, like making copies at the exact moment she heard his footsteps approaching. Other times she would rack her mind for some bit of work-related conversation that she could use just to watch his eyes hear her words, just long enough to pretend they were talking about something less forced. The napkin on the bar began to absorb a wet spot beneath it. It soaked up the water in a small circle, one less place for her to put down the words that were escaping her. His office was on the floor above her. His door was near the stairwell, so it was impossible for him to come down without passing by her door. Sometimes she pretended an errand to walk past his door, looking but not looking at him at his desk as she waited yet another opportunity. And then one day as she was making copies, he came in, just the two of them. He smiled at her, she smiled back. "I'm almost done," she said to him. He didn't know that she wanted to make copies forever. He didn't know that she was watching the way he wrote so neatly on the paper in his hand, the way he always did, his letters perfect blocks, hands she wanted to touch just once. "No rush. To tell you the truth, this is my last day, so no rush, you know." He smiled again. "Your last day?" "Yeah," he said, "I got a job in the city, advertising for Howard and Klein. Real big opportunity, you know, something I've been waiting for my whole life. I've always wanted to live in the city. I've always wanted to hear what they mean by it never sleeps." The city, wow, that's quite a step up. She used her brain to form a smile she couldn't feel. Yeah, I feel like things are gonna change, you know? I'm gonna finally be where I belong. I'm gonna have a whole new life. I don't know, I sound like a kid, huh? Man, when I reach the city. At the bar, the woman downed the last bit of bourbon glistening in the bottom of the glass. She watched a man and woman making out in a booth to her right, the woman putting her leg over his hand locked on the back of her neck, the darkness keeping it all together and pretty and real. The bartender was talking to an old man on the end bar stool. They were laughing about something, a dirty joke, a nagging wife at home, another whiskey. She picked up the pen and wrote what she wanted to say on the napkin. It was simple the way that truth is. The words came quickly and she didn't need much space. She thought of his face and all the time she tried to catch his eyes and all the days she wished she had told him that she loved him before she knew him and all the dreams she had of brushing the back of his hand. She thought of the number of hours in between the wanting, all the ways she could have used those minutes, all the conversations she could have had. The pen did feel good in her hand. It did feel better to write this down at this place, alone on a napkin that would soon be crumbled up in the bottom of a 2 a.m. garbage can. When she was done, she laid the pen down, put a 20 on the table for the bartender, and walked out into the night. As she walked from relative darkness to relative darkness, she thought about his smile, the muscles at the back of his neck, the way his voice would always sound, where he might be right now in that city, someplace with someone, the way his eyes lit up when he said, "When I reach the city," all that meant. Her own apartment was just 2 blocks away. She let it hurt all the way home. She thought about the napkin on the bar. She imagined where they could have been if only this were a story. As the bartender flashed the light signaling last call, the woman was just unlocking her front door. He gathered up the remaining glasses, cashed out the final patrons, and walked back over to the pen. The napkin had not been folded. It lay facing him, red ink a bit crooked from the bourbon, but mostly all in pet tact. He picked up the note from the woman to the man that would never be sent. It seemed okay to read it, so he did. It was short. He folded up the napkin and put it in his pocket. It didn't seem right to throw it away. He turned off the lights in the bar and locked the door. He touched the napkin in his pocket and thought about the words. He thought maybe he'd dream of them tonight, whatever they meant. When we reach the city, she had written in red ink with a mostly steady hand. When we reach the city.